Viewers of almost any age are likely familiar with Charlie Brown and one of his standard refrains, "Good grief." When I first heard it as a young boy, its contradictory quality didn't strike me. But today, even though I've searched its etymology and know better, I ponder it. Good grief. As in grief that's good, that serves a purpose, that might lead us to live more fully for having experienced it. Joining me today to discuss good grief is Claire Willis, a licensed social worker who has, over the past 2 decades, led workshops for people with life-threatening illness, and is author of the book Lasting Words, A Guide to Finding Meaning Toward the Close of Life. Welcome, Claire.
Thank you, Peter. I'm glad to be here.
Thanks for joining me. While we generally think of grief as, in the context of having lost a loved one, and certainly fair enough, it also casts itself on sort of a much wider set of losses. If you could start us out with a working definition of grief, as well as a sense of the varied reasons that we humans experience it.
Right. Grief, I think of grief as a multifaceted, normal, and natural response to loss, specifically around the rupture of a relationship. It's a full expression, and it's actually connected to a lot of other feelings, but it also always involves a certain level of emotional suffering. I think of grief as a lifelong companion, something that we really need to negotiate a relationship with. There are the obvious losses that come to all of us, of people, of parents, of siblings, of children, of relatives, family, friends. And then there are more what I call, or like to think of as invisible losses, the losses that are less culturally sanctioned in our culture. So, for instance, the loss of fertility for a woman, the loss of pets, the loss of homes, the loss of capacities as we grow old, which is sort of a process of gradual and diminishing capacity. And then there are the losses that I call them sort of macro losses, which are environmental losses and the losses incurred by war. While we don't know the people, there still is a rupture in sort of the human race through these losses. And almost always I think of grief as being a loss of whatever was normal to you, which involves finding meaning in what can often feel like a senseless event.
Right. Well, and I regrettably, far too many examples in recent years. I suppose that an instance like Brussels, like San Bernardino, it's removed from we here in Arlington, and yet it floods over us if we're attentive to media. And how do we connect those realities and those feelings to loss and grief? Certainly they're connected, but we're frequently not told that they should connect.
Yeah.
That we hold them apart somehow.
I think often there's a loss of innocence that results. I can remember when 9/11 happened, and it was sort of the first event in this country where there was massive loss, and there was basically, in a sense, an assault like war. Sure. And there was no comfort anywhere because everybody was sort of swimming in this confusion and disbelief. And I think these losses that happen on that level really send us into a loss of innocence, of loss of the way the world is supposed to be, the way our relationships are supposed to be. Right. And they're senseless in a certain way. Yeah.
I mean, I suppose to a certain extent that even at the macro level, that something like climate change, that certainly that also we are immersed in ongoing developments and understandings of what is happening in the world around us. And how do we respond to that as well? And certainly grief would be an appropriate label to place on that, yeah?
Yeah, grief is an appropriate label, and Joanna Macy certainly has written beautifully about that and invites us to...
Welcome back to Wide Angle. I'm Peter Bermudez, and I'm speaking today with Professor Carlos Hill about his new book, Beyond the Rope. Welcome back, Carlos.
Thank you for having me again.
Absolutely. So before the break, we left people with the beginnings of the understanding of the victimization narrative, trying to maybe humanize African Americans' experience at the hands of white lynch mobs. Yes? The NAACP at the time, we're talking, I think there's a specific reference to 1921 in your book, is trying to present a very sympathetic character in the African American lynched body, which you speak to. Can you give us a little bit more and fill that in a little bit? It sounded like certainly the compelling need was to counter the dominant narrative of the day, which is the black beast rapist narrative, and this was something that maybe could do that.
Yeah, I mean, the NAACP has a major challenge, and the major challenge that's preventing Congress from passing legislation is that African American men in particular, but African American people in general, are seen as less than, and in some cases subhuman. And so because of that, the NAACP has to convince white Americans that African Americans are deserving of respect, they're deserving of equality, and that African Americans are victims. They are being brutalized by lynching. And so this was the main challenge, right, of the NAACP. Despite all odds, was effective, right? So much so that today we primarily see African Americans who were lynched not as black beast rapists, but as victims, right? The problem with the story is that today we typically see African American lynch victims as simply victims, as only victims. And so my book tries to tell that much more complicated story of how African Americans conceived of black lynch victims in a myriad of ways, and principally through what I call consoling narratives of the lynched black body.
Right. I mean, and that's a beautiful pivot to that notion. So certainly the victimization narrative had a very specific purpose and moment. However, all of us can be victims for only so long, yes? And certainly the black community needed to perceive themselves as a community with agency and power to try to attempt to captain their own futures, if you will. And the consoling narrative is the story that the black community told itself through its newspapers, through authors like Richard Wright, Ida B. Wells. Can you tell us a little bit about the consoling narrative?
Yeah, I mean, before I go into that, I mean, I think there's an implicit assumption amongst individuals who try to create consoling narratives that history can either oppress you or it can liberate you, right? It can empower you or disempower you. And so victimization narratives of the lynched black body, although they were useful for political reasons, for political expediency, they were not very useful in terms of liberating African Americans. They weren't useful in terms of empowering African Americans to understand this history, the history of lynching. And so consoling narratives, what consoling narratives was about black agency, was about illustrating black agency, typically through black resistance to lynch mob violence. And so you had, in many of these consoling narratives, African Americans, whether individually or collectively, taking up arms against lynch mobs, fighting back. Now, the reason why I call them consoling narratives is because, and not triumphant narratives.
Let's say that there are parents out there who are concerned about the question of vaccination. They regard it as a question as opposed to a foregone conclusion, first of all. And they would like to maybe find a doctor who they feel they could have a conversation with. More than likely, they've heard that parents who were questioning of vaccination have in some cases been booted out of practices.
Absolutely.
So they're interested in having an open conversation with somebody who hopefully can give them information.
Absolutely.
How would they go about trying to find that person?
There are a growing number of doctors who will, even though they may disagree with you, they may try to argue with you or persuade you to agree to vaccinate your kid up to the hilt, but they won't put you down if you don't. They won't kick you out. They won't disrespect you. And those are the ones that you should seek out, because you shouldn't expect at this stage of the game that doctors are going to question vaccines, or because most of them don't. Very few of them do, although I must say the number is growing. It's certainly way bigger than it was when I got started on this. There are now, you know, some hundreds of doctors in the United States that are questioning various aspects of the vaccination process, and saying many of the same things that I've been saying. But the chances that any given individual is going to find one of them nearby is not that likely.
So is it effectively then maybe word of mouth, talking to other parents?
Yes.
Maybe conducting interviews with doctors and seeing what they're
looking, and also looking online
Okay.
for information, because that's where you'll find stuff.
Okay.
That's what parents are doing. There's a wonderful website called StopMandatoryVaccination.com, which has been collecting stories of parents whose children have been injured by vaccines because nobody else will print them. And there are hundreds and thousands of them. I've actually quoted some of them. They're really, they speak for themselves. And there are groups like that around.
Okay. And maybe you've predicted my next question, which can certainly be other resources.
Yes.
If hopefully people can find doctors, but websites, organizations, books.
The National Vaccine Information Center in Washington is a terrific resource. They have been, the woman who founded that, her child was brain damaged by the DPT vaccine back in the 1980s. And she was the one who almost single-handedly, with the help of a colleague whose child was also injured, founded a parents advocacy group, which was called, at that time, it was called DPT, Dissatisfied Parents Together. And it soon morphed into the National Vaccine Information Center. And they put out a newsletter which is very informative. They have chapters all over the country. They sponsor conferences every year, and that woman is still at it.
Another place that should be added to a list of resources around this is your website as well. Yes, there are a number of articles there.
Yeah, there are articles that I've written in the past.
Okay.
Yes.
And www.drrmosk.
Doctor written out, DOCTOR, rmosk.com.
M-O-S-K?
Yes.
.com. Well, Dr. Moskowitz, I can't thank you enough for joining me today.
It was a pleasure.
As well as for having, well, the courage and the bravery to ask those questions and go with your gut 40 years ago, and continue through the next 4 decades asking the questions again and again, trying to encourage people to engage with them as well.
Yeah.
I thank you.
Well, it was a pleasure being here.
We Americans have a reputation for being an irreverent lot, with little respect for sacred cows. If challenged by said cows, we tend to ask questions, dig beneath the surface, and challenge authority, even if, at the risk of mixing metaphors, it might ruffle some feathers. And vaccination seems a perfect candidate for such treatment. Yet as described by my guest today, this issue illustrates the exception to that rule, with many of us reflexively following public health mandates, little considering what it is that vaccines might be doing to us and our children, in addition to the jobs for which we created them. Perhaps only further reflection, along with some significant research conducted after an informed and empowered public has demanded it, will reveal a deeper truth. For Dr. Richard Moskowitz, I'm Peter Bermudez. Thank you for joining us for this edition of Wide Angle.